Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses today.
Wait, listen.
Professor Sarin, you're a professor at Yale Law School?
I am.
Okay. And I see you've been pretty active on Twitter. I'm looking at one of your tweets from a few months ago, October 30th, 2023. I'd like to read it to you. The House Republican stance is, I kid you not, support for Israel as long as we make it easier for people to cheat on their taxes. End quote. Did you tweet that?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. How many Republican congressmen or women did you talk to before you made that statement?
I was reacting to the fact that, and we've talked about it actually.
Yes,
so
ma'am,
far
but
in this.
first, if you could, how many Republican congresswomen or congressmen did you talk to?
I didn't talk to them. I actually was just reacting to the legislation that was proposed.
You didn't talk to any of them
No, sir.
before you said that every single one of them supports Israel only if it is made easier for people to cheat on their taxes?
I actually don't think that every single one of them believes
But
that.
that's what you
But I
said.
do think that the legislation passed by the House reflects a statement of purpose that in order to support Israel, it's
But I'm
important
looking at
to
what you said.
allow
what your
taxpayers to
students
be able
saw.
to cheat on their taxes.
You said that every single House Republican, none of whom you talked to, would only support Israel if it was made easier for Americans to cheat on their taxes. Now, you said that, and you didn't talk to any of them.
Senator Kennedy,
Didn't.
I am struck by, and perhaps this is something on which we agree, that it is incredibly important to support Israel. It is also incredibly important to make sure that taxpayers at the top of the distribution
we agree on
pay their
Israel,
fair
but I
share.
just can't believe you would say this about members of Congress. It's pretty pejorative, vicious. Let me finish. Without talking to them. I mean, would it be possible for somebody to support a reduction to the IRS budget because they simply believe the federal government ought to have a balanced budget? Would that be a fair position? Would that be a principled position?
Except that that actually doesn't work with respect to defunding
Would it
the
be a
IRS.
principled position?
It wouldn't be an accurate position because defunding
But you don't
the
know because you
IRS
didn't talk to anybody, did you?
Well,
you just said it.
Defunding the IRS, the CBO agrees, everyone who's testifying today agrees that that is going to add to deficits, not reduce
Could
them.
it be that a House Republican wanted to reduce the IRS's budget because they think that the IRS is a model of inefficiency and shouldn't be rewarded with more money?
Well,
Could that have been a possibility, a motivation for the way they
Senator
voted?
Kennedy, I so appreciate that question because the reality
Could that have been
that the
a
reason-
motivation for the way they voted?
and it relates very closely to what Senator
Could
King
that have
said,
been a motivation for the way they
reason
voted?
that you've seen an inefficient
Could that have
IRS.
been a motivation
If you allow
for
the
the way
witness
they
to
voted?
answer, you might get your answer, Senator
It
Kennedy.
frankly couldn't have been.
It
because
could or couldn't?
It could not have been.
How do you know you didn't talk to him?
Because the reason why you've seen
You
an
just
IRS
made this
that
statement that
hasn't been able.
every Republican in the House supports Israel only if it has been made easier for people to cheat on their taxes. Could it be that maybe a House member thought that, well, the more money we spend, the more deficits we have, and the more deficits we have, the more pressure is put on interest rates, and the higher interest rates go, the more it hurts the poor. Could that have been
Senator
the position
Kennedy,
of one of the House Republicans?
Senator Kennedy,
Could it have been theoretically?
couldn't have been because
Could it-
everyone
it couldn't have
agrees.
been?
It frankly couldn't.
How do you
have
know
been.
you didn't talk to him?
Well, I know that everyone agrees, including witnesses across the aisle, including CBO, including every single tax expert that has contemplated this question, that defunding the IRS makes deficits worse, not better. And so this is a deficit
I just find it,
measure.
Professor, appalling that you would make a statement like this, a vicious statement like this, without talking to a single person about whom you made this statement. And I'm going to remind you, you know, you can only be young once, but you can always be immature. And you ought to think about that.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Let me just say that I think that the treatment of witnesses is beginning to degrade a bit here. And I'm going to strike some commentary if it continues down this road. I think personal insults to witnesses are not appropriate, and I will not be tolerant of that in this committee.
Well, could I respond, Mr. Chairman? You're going to
Fire away. I think you just called a
You're
Yale
going to
Law
do
School
what you got to
professor
do,
immature.
but I'm going to continue to use my time. You bring witnesses as you're entitled to, and some of them are very good. Some of them have the credibility of Michael Avenatti, and I'm going to use my time when I think it's appropriate to
And I'm
test.
going to use my authority as chairman
to test
as I think
credibility,
it is appropriate
witnesses'
as well,
credibility.
in order
So you
to
do
keep
what you
order
got to do, and I'm going to
and
do what I got to do.
good behavior in
But
a
if that
Senate
is meant
committee.
to bully me, you're talking
No
to the
attempt to
wrong
bully
guy.
you. No attempt to bully you, none at all. It's to keep the witness and the committee free of bullying.
I'm entitled to test their credibility, and I think one of our witnesses just got tested.
I hope I passed, Senator. Thank you.
You didn't.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start at the outset. I'm an accountant. I value audits. My wife was an IRS auditor, so we need that. There's no doubt about it. Okay, you can argue legitimately, to what extent, how many auditors, how much we should spend on it. That's legitimate conversation. I do have to admit, though, every time I hear the chairman or the chairman of the Finance Committee say the word wealthy tax cheat, I think of the name Hunter Biden and all of the Biden family members who have been participating in his influence peddling grifts. I think it's interesting, as much as this hearing is emphasizing on audits, that when Senator Grassley and I were conducting our very legitimate investigation, using our constitutional responsibility of oversight, when we were investigating tax cheating, influence peddling, money coming in, tens of millions of dollars from foreign entities to impact potentially U.S. policy. Democrat senators, our ranking members, not only frustrated, I would say obstructed our investigation by falsely claiming we were soliciting and disseminating Russian disinformation. Now, that just happened to parrot what we've now found out the FBI set up their Foreign Influence Task Force, what they were doing in their catch and kill operation, find derogatory information that was being developed by 40 confidential human sources, and then go kill it. Go say, no, don't look into that. Don't go down that investigatory hole, because that's Russian disinformation. So the question I have based on that, Professor Sarin, it's obvious we have a dual system of justice applied to tax compliance. When somebody is connected politically as Hunter Biden, when his investigatory team allows the statute of limitations to expire on the most serious tax evasion charges, what does that dual system of justice, what does that do in terms of taxpayer compliance?
So, Senator Johnson, I actually want to take a step even higher, but with your sort of
Quickly, please.
Theme of democracy and heart. In this country today, we have a two-tiered tax system, as you acknowledge. Your constituents who are wage earners are already paying everything that they owe, and a very small proportion of very wealthy individuals and large corporations have the opportunity to...
Okay, and that was your testimony. Again, I want you to speak to the fact that the president's son is largely skating because they allowed the statute of limitations to run. What does that do to compliance in terms of Americans' attitude toward that, Professor Hendren? I've got other things I need to get to here.
I have very little to say on Hunter Biden. It's a very small portion of the tax gap.
that is true, but it's a very large portion in terms of Americans' attitude toward our dual system of justice.
So
Mr. Edwards, what do you think that does in terms of the public opinion of complying with taxes when one wealthy, connected individual basically avoids prosecution?
I agree, and it shows a general problem. There's a huge IRS management problem. We ought to fix IRS management before anything else. The IRS, lost or destroyed 30 million tax returns in Ogden, Utah. They don't have a good explanation for that. The huge theft of thousands of high-end tax returns a couple years ago. There's a big management
politically motivated theft and then distribution to ProPublica. Okay, that's politically motivated. I want to turn to the solution here. Again, I'm all for auditing. We're always going to need it. The solution is simplifying and rationalizing our tax code. I developed this chart years ago. I think it's quite interesting. This goes back to 1959 and shows the top marginal tax rate. To what extent were we going to punish success, and then the extent to which we were successful at punishing success. It's remarkable. Over 60-some years, we've had as top tax rate as high as 91%, 70%, 50%, 28, 31, 39.6, 35. Now we're at 37%. But over that 60-year time period, the average percent of GDP that we've raised in revenue is 17.3%. It doesn't change much because our tax code is so complex and as a result so difficult to comply with. It is notable that even after the tax cuts from 2018, the last 3 years has been above that average, 17.9, 19.6%. Last year was 18.2%. So increasing tax rates is not going to work. I would say dramatically, and I mean dramatically simplifying, but also use the term rationalizing. Our tax code is completely irrational. We have different forms of tax rates on different kinds of incomes. I mean, income ought to be income. From my standpoint, it ought to be based on cash generation. There's so many ways of simplifying this, and right there, you would dramatically increase compliance because, again, if tax rates are kept low, it's easy to comply with. There's the solution. Let's quit talking about sending more agents to harass Americans, and let's talk about the real solution, which is simplification and rationalization. Would any of you like to comment on that?
I would just like to comment. Professor Sarin's chart that was put up by the chairman is a fascinating chart. I would differ from Senator Romney in that it's true that modern businesses got complex. A lot of what drives that chart, frankly, is corporations making extremely sophisticated structures to avoid tax. They don't try to do things that are illegal. It's just that the tax code is so gray, they push the limits, and that's what I experienced at 5 years of PwC. That's what they try to do, push to the limit of a very gray code.
We turn now to Senator Lee, who will be followed by Senator Kane.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to each of you for being here. Based on the title of today's hearing, one might think that America's wealthiest taxpayers are just robbing or constantly shortchanging the U.S. Treasury. This is exaggerated, and it's ultimately inaccurate. It's a disingenuous claim that's used as justification for pursuing a historic expansion of federal spending and a radical redistributive economic policy agenda that would make FDR and LBJ blush. Now, let's be clear. For obvious good reason, tax evasion is very much illegal under our federal tax code. It's illegal, it's wrong, and it's to be discouraged and punished whenever it's found. Many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle frequently conflate, perhaps knowingly, perhaps not, illegal tax evasion, which has a technical meaning under the law, with legal measures that taxpayers may use legally to reduce their tax liability. There is a difference between those two things, and those things matter. And by all means, we should debate whether some of these tax expenditures, such as the SALT deduction, ought to exist and to what extent they ought to be recognized. And instead, many in today's Congress and in this administration have called for confiscatory tax policies that are either unconstitutional, such as the wealth tax, or unjustifiable and extremely complex proposals that seek to tax gains that have not yet been realized as income. Those, I would add, are almost certainly unconstitutional themselves. So when it comes to so-called tax fairness, it's definitely worth remembering. The U.S. tax code has been and continues to be undeniably very progressive. Let's look at the most recent Treasury Office of Tax Analysis estimates on the national individual tax burden. Those show us a few things. They show us, for example, that the top 1% of U.S. taxpayers earned roughly 20% of all income nationally, and while earning roughly 20% of all income nationally, paid 42% of total federal income taxes. So this group's average federal income tax rate was 22%. The bottom 50%, on the other hand, earned 14% of all income nationally and paid negative 5.5% of total federal income taxes. This group's average federal income tax rate was negative 6.3%, meaning net federal tax burdens on average are actually negative for the lower half of American taxpayers by household income. In other words, they're getting more back through refundable tax credits than what they pay in. If this isn't evidence of an overwhelmingly progressive federal tax system currently in place, I don't know what would be. I don't know how it could be more progressive than that within our system. Even if we look at the distribution of the federal tax burden in a broader way by including the payroll tax burden, the federal tax code remains overwhelmingly progressive. Another inconvenient truth that some of my colleagues like to omit while making claims of how desperately we need more tax revenue is that federal tax revenue as a percentage of GDP was 19.6% in 2022. This is unusually high. In fact, this is the second highest level in the last 60 years, and about 2 percentage points higher than the historic average during that time period. Even during periods when the top marginal tax rate has been much, much higher, like well into the 70s. Ironically, this explosive growth in revenue was driven in large part from significantly higher than expected income tax collections from realized capital gains. Regrettably, spending in 2022 as a percent of GDP was still 5 percentage points higher than the historical average. Further, federal revenues have averaged 17.3% of GDP over the last 10 years, in line with the 60-year historical average of 17.4%, but federal spending has averaged 23%, way above the 60-year historical average of 20%. And that's only projected to increase, thus creating many of the problems that we've got. Mr. Edwards, in your written testimony, you mentioned that while tax enforcement is certainly a worthy goal, the $80 billion of additional mandatory funding for the IRS is excessive. Can you describe some of the reasons why this was an unnecessarily large funding boost for the IRS and perhaps some of the unintended consequences likely to result from it?
Well, let me start by saying I agree with what Senator Merkley was saying and what you're saying about fairness. We all want fairness. I just think by going to the enforcement lever first, you're putting the cart before the horse. The better way to improve tax compliance, increase fairness for everyone, is to simplify the tax code, improve IRS customer service, improve their IRS technology, and that way we'd boost tax compliance and would be good for taxpayers and the economy. Enforcement is a win-lose proposition, especially when the tax code is so complicated. It creates a lot of collateral damage on businesses and individuals who are already paying the proper amount.
Well, that's right. Let's see, my time's expired. It is worth noting here again, even when our top marginal rates were sky high, we still weren't departing meaningfully. We still weren't reaping more than the historical average of just under 17.5% of GDP. So that candle can only be burned so many ways. It doesn't make that big of a difference on that end and can reduce compliance and therefore ultimately reduce revenue. Thank you.